I couldn't tell you when it started. All my life, I've had vivid dreams, and they were always something of a spectacle to my family. Ever since I can remember, I've come downstairs to my parents, making breakfast in their pajamas, ready to ask me about what adventure I went on this time. Their favorite stories were the ones where I could fly, because I would always make sure to fly past our house and say hi to them. Even in the times when my dreams didn't include it, sometimes I would tell them it did because it endeared them so much that they couldn't help but smile, and so I would smile too. After a while, the pretty, pleasant dreams were anything but. The older I became, the more mature and twisted the dreams were. Some were mild and simply startling, but others felt like car crashes or train wrecks. So fast you can't possibly stop them, but slowed down just enough that you know how bad it hurts before it's over. I would wake up screaming and thrashing, and my parents would run upstairs to my room to smooth my hair and tell me it was just a dream. They stopped asking what happened, and I stopped telling them. We went on that way for years. So long, in fact, that I forgot almost what it was like to have a dream about fun things. Sometimes I would have a dream that was almost peaceful, and I would wake up so relieved and confused and grateful to have a real night's sleep for a change. When I was in my early 20s, the nightmares got so bad that I went to a psychiatrist. She recommended that I go on medication to help blot the dreams out. It wasn't so much that I would stop having them, but that I would sleep so deeply I wouldn't remember them when I woke up. It wasn't ideal, but it was a compromise I could live with. I'd rather forget I dreamed at all than feel the gripping fear and paranoia I was living with almost every day now. I would leave my house and stare at people, wondering if I was still asleep. I would pinch myself and drink my coffee too early in the hopes that the burn would remind me I was awake. It worked most of the time. The thing they don't tell you about nightmares is that sometimes they feel so incredibly real. Sometimes it would be so intense that I'd wake up with bruises. That slowed down when I filled my first prescription and finally got a night of rest. It was glorious. It was though everything in the world finally fell into place. I was hanging out with my friends again, working harder in college than ever, and committed to my job. I wasn't dating, but I didn't need to be. I was finally on track to keep going with the rest of my life, and while there was some part of me that missed the stories, missed the adventures of a child flying past their old house, I couldn't say I missed anything else about dreaming. My father always told me that he wished he'd done something sooner about my nightmares, but I don't blame him. For an army guy, therapy is stigmatized in every way. He's trained not to think about it, and sometimes I think so was I. My mother really wasn't a believer in the system herself, or maybe it just never occurred to her. She didn't talk about it, and something always gave me the impression she didn't want to. If we ever did talk about dreams, my mother would tell me how sometimes she would wake up and see things from her dreams, and she'd forget if it was real or all in her head. We talked about it at length more than once, but though our experiences were similar, my mother never mentioned how it stopped. She simply didn't talk about it anymore, and that was that. Sometimes I wondered if she still had those awful dreams, the way I might have. I didn't ask. The only detail she ever gave me was one I wish she hadn't mentioned, a deep, guttural growling sound that haunted her, even still. It sent shivers down my spine to think of it. The medication was a godsend, and I couldn't have been happier, but after a while, you develop a tolerance to it. That's what I concluded on the day I woke up to a horrifying visage. A man, standing beside my bed with a twisted, sewn-up mouth, frowning at me, leaned over at an awful angle and staring me in the eyes. I screamed and shoved him back and ran out of the room. He grabbed my arm as I was trying to flee, and I felt his nails scrape down my wrist as I rushed out the door and flew down my dorm steps and out into the cold morning air in nothing more than a tank top and sweats. The guards had to catch me and calm me down. They pulled me into their little booth, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and sent one of their own to check my room. No one was there. No one but my roommate, anyway, who wasn't pleased to be woken up so early in the morning by security guards coming through the door. I was surprised my screaming hadn't disturbed her. In fact, she said she hadn't even noticed me leaving. I called my psychiatrist, but she wouldn't be back in the office for 2 weeks, so I had to bide my time. Surely it was a fluke. Sometimes I would still remember glimpses of my dreams. Medication wasn't perfect, I told myself, and allowed myself to be reassured by the notion that it was only 2 weeks, and if anything was really wrong, the doctor would know what to do, and it would all be okay. In the meantime, I downloaded one of those apps that tracks your sleep. I figured it might help tell me a little bit of what I might improve on, and I took to drinking relaxing sleepy time teas before bed. I wasn't much of a tea drinker before this, to be honest, but anything to relax my mind was more than welcome. My roommate said she'd be sure to sleep light, and she was only a while away if I needed her. I smiled, thanked her, took my meds, and fell asleep listening to ocean sounds by my laptop. When I woke up, my whole body felt stiff and ached as if I'd spent the night running. My legs were red and raw, scraped up and down my calves. I vaguely remembered climbing a tree in my dream and winced, running my fingertips over the raw bumps and scratches. I really must have done a number thrashing, I told myself. I'd clawed myself open before, but my legs had, until this point, remained relatively unscathed by my subconscious and its sick sense of humor. I pulled up the app and looked over my data. Sure enough, it didn't look good. I had gotten almost no restful sleep. I was exhausted, and the sleep app had recorded dozens of sleep sounds throughout the night. Groans, moans, quiet cries and whimpers, grunting and gasping. It sounded like I was struggling through a fight I could barely remember. I just remembered that I was running. From what, I couldn't be sure. What I was sure of was that I didn't want to know. It was better off this way. That day in class, all I could focus on was the weight of my eyelids and the burning pain in my legs. It got so bad that my professor stopped me on the way out of the hall and commented that I didn't look well. I tried not to take it as an insult and let him guide me into his office to ask what was wrong. I explained in as little detail as I could that I had nightmares and that they were getting worse again. I told him I was going to see my doctor soon about adjusting my medications, and then I'd be fine. He told me that he'd call my other professors and gather my notes for me, but that he'd like to see me go home and rest. I tried to resist, but I had to admit a nap sounded downright divine, even if I was nervous about what dreams may come. I took him up on his offer and headed back to the room, setting my stuff down with a grunt and walking over to my bed, face planting into the sheets and groaning. I looked at my phone and sighed, picking it up and turning on the sleep app. I indicated that I was going to be taking a nap, set it up to take down whatever notes it took, and curled up under my sheets. It took me no time at all to fall asleep and right into a dream. For the first time in years, I was really experiencing my dreams. Sure, I surmised I must have been experiencing them the whole time, but now it was different. Like when I was a child, there was an intense, vivid nature to the dream that roared around me as I flailed my legs in the cold shock of ocean water. I scrambled, looking in all directions against the heavy fall of rain, hitting me in the eyes and all but blinding me. It was dark, with rain clouds and the occasional crack of lightning doing little to illuminate anything except the distant, glowing shoreline and a tall lighthouse with no light scanning the rough, choppy waters. I forced my tired arms to pull myself towards the shore, struggling against a current that thrashed me back and forth, dragging me into the black, murky depths of the water and shocking my lungs whenever I would take an ill-timed breath. But I had to keep pushing. I had to keep going. Thunder boomed overhead, so loud and intense that I swore the water itself trembled violently, like stone ready to break apart. The waves crashed over me and I coughed up salty water the whole way to the sharp, biting grains of sand I dug my fingers into, dragging myself onto shore with ragged, concussive breaths that ripped their way through my nose and throat. "Help!" I screamed, scrambling to tug myself onto the beach and away from the water, which lapped violently against the shore and threatened to tug me back into their depths. The watery fingers scratched at my bare skin where my pants had shredded, and I shivered, kicking them away and stumbling blindly to my feet. The cascades of rain blurred the landscape and collided with my head, shoulders, and back like shotgun pellets, and I strangled cries of pain as I begged my feet to pull me forward, and winced as they painfully complied. My hand came to rest on a rotting wooden post driven into the damp sand and dirt near the edge of a path, winding and slick, up to the lighthouse, which now appeared to be more like a formidable shadow, staring down at me with 1,000 unseen eyes. I shuddered, but soldiered on, feet slapping against the soaked, soggy wooden planks that led the way to what could either be my salvation or my doom. There was no door on the lighthouse to lean against or unlock, and the instant my feet touched the icy tile of the inside, my balance gave way and I tumbled, slamming headlong into the edge of a spiraling stair. The jagged corner dug into my elbow, and I cried out as a hot, searing pain rushed through me. I glanced down and, though it was frightfully dark, managed to make out the unmistakable stain of fresh blood and the smell of hot copper. I cursed under my breath and grappled my way to my feet, cradling my injured arm to my chest as I climbed mindlessly up the spiraling steps to the top of the lighthouse. My feet clapped against the floor quietly, and the steady dripping of the ocean and rainwater covered the tile around me in shallow puddles. I shivered and tugged my arms as close to my body as I could, groping along the wall when the light became too dim between flashes of lightning that were echoed by thunder so loud I thought the building might come apart around me. I screamed and wished desperately I could cover my ears, but I didn't have the time. I may not have known what was behind me, but something told me I wasn't alone as I made my way up the final steps and up to the massive mechanism at the top of the lighthouse. Lens after lens after lens lined the far wall right before a massive circular glass like a magnifier cut into the dense blackness of the night, ready to send a beam of light into the darkness. In the center of the room was a lamp, ready and waiting to be lit, with a small box of matches inside it. I stumbled over and struggled to pull out a match, hands shaking, and light it. The first match caught a few times, but fizzled out in my hands, and I cursed, throwing it carelessly onto the floor and pulling out the next, striking it 3 times before finally, gloriously, it blazed to life, and I tossed it into the lamp, where the oil caught fire and an intense beam of light exploded from within, piercing the night sky and illuminating far into the violent tides of the ocean I'd barely scrambled my way out of. I shivered and huddled close to the lamp, grateful for the light, but also the warmth of the small but calming flame. Finally, I stopped to inspect my elbow, which was still bleeding rather profusely from the impeccably straight cut I'd managed to acquire from the edge of the step. I cursed and bent over as best as I could to get a better look, but I wasn't able to think of much anything productive before I heard it, the telltale clomp of wet boots on hard tiles. It was winding up the stairs, slowly and purposefully, behind me. I shivered and stepped back once towards the wall, away from the stairs. Once, twice, 3 times before my back was pinned against the frigid glass. The footsteps were drawing ever nearer as I slowly wound my way away from the door to the stairs and over to the door to the outside. If I could just make it outside, I could crouch behind the wall and maybe buy myself some time. All I needed was just a little bit of time, but I wasn't allowed it as the door slammed open with a bang, and a man slinked slowly and purposefully over to the glowing lamp. He stared at it, and then bent down, back warped and misshapen, touching his fingers to the puddle on the ground. He lifted them up to his face, and I could see the slick droplets of my own, diluted blood trickling down his hand. When he turned his head, carefully and deliberately, I saw the twisted, sewn edges of a forced frown that sent chills down my spine. His eyes trailed their way over the wall, down the line, to where I was crouched against the wall, hardly breathing and not moving. He straightened up as much as he could and slowly shifted, laboriously, to face me. His hideous face was cast in severe shadows as he inspected me like he wanted to speak. Instead, he let out a guttural, low groan that sliced through my memory like a knife. I'd heard that sound before. I knew it. I didn't have time to place it before he was moving, shambling towards me as fast as he could manage. I screamed and got to my feet faster than I thought possible, rushing to the door to the outside and struggling with the doorknob, which turned, and clicked treacherously in my hand. "No!" I screeched. "No!" His hand reached out and clasped onto my shoulder, and I wrenched away, screaming and falling to the ground. "Sarah!" I woke with a start and crawled back into the wall, drenched and shivering. My roommate rushed to my side and grabbed my face in her hands. "You're freezing!" she exclaimed in a panic, shaking her head and then pulling up my arm. "What the hell happened?" I followed her eyes, struggling to rein in my breath, and stared in disbelief at the cut on my elbow. Perfectly straight and gushing blood. I broke away from her and stared at my bed. It was soaked and smelled distinctly of salt. My roommate called an ambulance and I was taken to the ER to stitch up my arm and warm me back up. I didn't tell a soul what I'd seen. How could I? They'd think I was going mad. Some part of me thought I was too, but the rest of me knew something was happening that couldn't be explained. The salt water, the cut on my elbow, the scrapes on my wrist from the frowning man in my bedroom. Those things I knew weren't something I could rationalize. I called my mother that night and told her I was coming home for a little while. Something tells me we have a lot to talk about. I don't know who the frowning man is, but I do know I've seen him before, in my dreams. As a child, he was always there. He was the thing that sent me running every time the nightmares were bad enough to trap me for hours. The frowning man wasn't new, but he was still chasing me, and no psychiatrist or sleep medication was going to help me fix what was happening to me. I have to remember when it started, and I think if there's anyone in this world who's going to have those answers, it's my mother. It can't be a coincidence that she heard him, at least once, and that at some point, he haunted her, too.